The first time I understood they didn't see me as one of them, it wasn't during an argument or a dramatic breakup or some obvious betrayal. It was quieter than that. It was a look, a pause that lasted half a second too long, a small shift of bodies in a hallway, the way people move when they think something dangerous is about to brush past them. I used to believe family was the one place on earth where you didn't have to explain your intentions, where your presence wasn't questioned, where you could be tired or hurting or confused and still be held like you belonged. That's what I told myself after my mom died, after my life split into before and after, and I was sent to live with my aunt and uncle in a house that looked like it belonged in a holiday commercial. Neat lawn, white fence, two cars that always looked clean, a porch swing nobody actually used. From the outside, it was the kind of place people assumed would fix you. Inside, I learned fast that love can look polite and still feel like exile. My Aunt Carol hugged me the day I arrived. It was the kind of hug that ended too quickly, like she'd completed a task and wanted to move on to the next one. My uncle, Mark, patted my shoulder with a hand that felt heavy and careful, like he didn't want to touch too much. Their son, Ethan, stared at me from the staircase, the way a kid stares at a stray dog that might bite. They gave me a room. They made space in the fridge. They told people at church they were stepping up. And at first, I swallowed my gratitude so hard it felt like I was trying to choke down glass. I tried to be easy. I tried to be invisible. I tried to be the kind of grief that didn't stain the furniture. But grief doesn't ask permission. It shows up in the way you flinch at laughter, in the way silence feels like a threat, in the way your brain replays the last day you saw your mother alive until you can't remember what her voice sounded like without hearing the beeping of hospital monitors behind it. The first month, I cried in the shower because it was the only place I could make noise without anyone getting uncomfortable. The second month, I stopped crying because I realized my pain wasn't welcome here. It made the house tense. It made Carol's smile tighten. It made Mark's voice drop into that calm, controlled tone adults use when they're trying not to say what they really think. By the third month, I could feel the truth in the air. They weren't afraid of what I'd done. They were afraid of what I might do. I didn't even understand why at first. I was a 17-year-old girl who'd lost everything familiar. I wasn't angry in the way movies show anger. I wasn't screaming or throwing things. My rebellion was smaller. I stopped volunteering extra details about my day. I stopped trying to convince them I was grateful. I wore my sadness the way you wear a bruise under long sleeves. Careful, hidden, and still aching. That's when the help started turning into surveillance. Carol began knocking before she came into my room, but she never waited for an answer. It was like she needed to prove to herself she had access. Mark started asking questions that didn't feel like concern. They felt like a checklist. Where are you going? Who will be there? When will you be back? Why didn't you answer your phone? Ethan started watching me the way he watched the front door when strangers came to sell something. Then little things started changing, like the house was rearranging itself around the idea that I was a problem. A spare key that used to hang by the kitchen calendar disappeared. My phone charger would show up unplugged, moved slightly, like someone had picked it up and put it back down to see what it was attached to. The hallway light outside my room started staying on all night. Carol claimed it helped her feel safe getting up to use the bathroom. Safe. That word landed in my chest like a stone. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself grief was making me paranoid. I told myself I should be grateful I had a roof and food and adults willing to take me in. I repeated those thoughts like prayers, because the alternative was too painful to admit, that the people who called me family had already decided I was something to manage, not someone to love. The moment it finally snapped into focus happened on an ordinary Tuesday. I came home from school with my backpack heavy, and my head even heavier. The house smelled like lemon cleaner, sharp and sterile. Carol was at the kitchen counter, wiping the same spot over and over, like she was trying to erase something that wasn't visible. Mark sat at the table with papers spread in front of him. They didn't look up right away. That alone made my stomach tighten, the way it does when you sense a storm before you hear thunder. Carol finally lifted her eyes and smiled a little too hard. Mark tapped one of the papers with his finger. slow and deliberate. I recognized the tone before he even spoke because I'd heard it from teachers right before a punishment. Calm. Controlled. Certain that whatever happened next was justified. They told me they wanted to talk. I sat down because I didn't know what else to do. My palms were damp. My heartbeat felt loud in my ears. They asked about my grades, but not in a normal way. They asked like they were looking for evidence. They asked about my friends, but not like they cared if I was lonely, more like they wanted to know who might influence me. They asked if I'd been sleeping, if I'd been eating, if I ever felt overwhelmed. The words were soft, but the energy was sharp. Then Mark slid one of the papers toward me. It wasn't a report card. It wasn't school paperwork. It was a printed screenshot of a post I'd written late at night, weeks earlier, when grief had swallowed me whole. A few sentences about feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, about being tired, about missing my mom so much it physically hurt. Nothing violent, nothing threatening, just raw sadness. And yet, the way they looked at it like it was a weapon made my skin go cold. Carol said they were concerned. Mark said they had to think about the whole household. Ethan, standing in the doorway, stared at me like I'd been caught doing something shameful. My throat tightened so hard I could barely swallow, because I realized, in that instant, what was happening. They'd been watching me, reading my private words, collecting pieces of me like proof. Not because they wanted to understand my pain, but because they wanted to measure it, contain it, control it. They didn't see a grieving teenager. They saw a risk. They called me family. But they were treating me like a threat. And as Mark's hand hovered over the stack of papers, more screenshots, more notes, more concerns, I understood this wasn't just a conversation. It was an assessment. A decision was already being formed. And the worst part was that I could feel it. No matter what I said next, they weren't going to believe the truth. They were going to believe the version of me they'd invented in their own fear. Mark leaned forward, still calm, still controlled, and said there was something else I needed to see. He reached for the next page. And that's when I noticed the title at the top typed in bold like an official document, something that made my stomach drop so fast it felt like the floor disappeared. Because it wasn't about my grades. It wasn't about my sadness. It was about what they were planning to do with me. They never said I was grounded. They never said I was being punished. That's what made it worse. Everything was wrapped in the language of concern, responsibility, and what's best for everyone. But the freedom I hadn't realized I still had disappeared piece by piece, quietly, the way daylight fades without you noticing until it's dark. My phone started dying more often. At first, I blamed the battery. Then I noticed apps I didn't remember downloading, settings changed just enough to make me doubt myself. Location services always on, notifications delayed. Once, I found my phone warm on my desk when I knew I hadn't touched it in hours. When I asked about it, Carol smiled and said she was just making sure it was charged so I could reach them if I needed help. Help felt a lot like being watched. I stopped writing online after that. Not because my pain was gone, but because I realized my thoughts weren't mine anymore. Every sentence felt like it might end up printed out, highlighted, slid across a table as proof that something was wrong with me. So I swallowed my words instead. I locked them inside my chest and let them sit there, heavy and unspoken. School became the only place where I could breathe, but even that started to change. Mark began driving me instead of letting me take the bus. He said it was safer. He said he liked knowing where I was. His car smelled like coffee and control, and every ride felt like an unspoken interrogation. He'd ask about my classes, my teachers, my friends, always listening a little too closely, like he was searching for cracks in my answers. If I paused before responding, his eyes would flick to the rearview mirror. At home, Carol reorganized the kitchen so that nothing was where I remembered it being. She said she was just being efficient, but every change reminded me that this wasn't my space to settle into. I was a guest who'd overstayed her welcome, a variable that needed adjusting. Even Ethan changed. He used to ignore me, which at least felt honest. Now he hovered. If I stayed in my room too long, he'd pass by, accidentally. If I laughed at something on my phone, he'd glance over like laughter itself was suspicious. Once, I caught him standing outside my door, just listening. When I opened it, he jumped and pretended he was looking for the bathroom. I didn't confront him. I didn't confront any of them. Because confrontation requires power, and I could feel mine slipping away. The worst part wasn't the rules they never officially stated. It was the way they framed everything as if I were fragile and dangerous at the same time. Like a glass object that might shatter, but also cut someone if handled wrong. They spoke about me when they thought I couldn't hear. Lowered voices. My name followed by words like risk, phase, and unstable, said gently, like that made them kinder. I started doubting myself. I wondered if maybe I really was unpredictable. Maybe my grief had turned me into someone unsafe to be around. Maybe the tightness in my chest and the constant exhaustion were signs that something was wrong with me, not with the way I was being treated. That's the thing about control. When it's disguised as care, it makes you question your own reality. One night, I came home 10 minutes later than usual because my teacher had kept me after class. When I walked through the front door, the house was too quiet. Carol was sitting on the couch, hands folded, posture perfect. Mark stood near the hallway, arms crossed. Ethan hovered behind him like backup. They didn't yell. They didn't accuse. They told me they'd been worried. They told me they'd tried calling. They told me they needed to know where I was at all times so nothing bad could happen. Nothing bad. As if something bad was always just one wrong move away from happening, and I was the one who might cause it. I apologized, even though my throat burned with the unfairness of it. I apologized because it was easier than explaining. Easier than reminding them I was still a person, not a liability. Mark nodded, like my apology confirmed something he'd already believed. Carol smiled, relieved, like order had been restored. That night, I noticed a new small camera plugged into the outlet near the front door. They said it was for security. They said it wasn't about me, but it was always about me. I began sleeping with my door locked, even though it made Carol upset. She said it wasn't healthy to shut people out. I didn't tell her that locking the door was the only way I could convince myself my thoughts were still private, that my body was still mine. The house felt smaller every day. My room, once just a room, became a bunker. I'd sit on my bed and listen to footsteps in the hallway, learning to recognize who was walking by the rhythm alone. I measured my words carefully at dinner. I laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I kept my head down and my emotions flatter than they really were. Because any sign of intensity, even joy, seemed to make them nervous. They said they wanted me to heal. But healing, to them, meant becoming quieter, smaller, easier to predict. I started keeping track of things in my head instead of on paper. Dates, times, changes. I didn't know why yet. I just felt a growing need to remember, to hold on to proof of my own experience in case someone tried to rewrite it later. And then one afternoon, while looking for a sweater in the hall closet, I found something that made my hands shake so badly I had to sit down on the floor. A folder. My name written on it in black marker. Inside were notes, observations, dates, times, things I'd said, written down out of context. Normal moments twisted into warning signs. Pages that told a story about me I barely recognized, but one that painted me as unstable, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. That's when it finally hit me. This wasn't temporary. They weren't just worried. They were building a case. And whatever they were preparing for, I had a terrible feeling it was already in motion. Finding that folder changed something inside me that I don't think ever fully healed. Until then, a small part of me still believed this was all a misunderstanding, that if I stayed calm enough, grateful enough, quiet enough, they would eventually relax, that they'd see I wasn't a problem to solve, just a person trying to survive loss. That illusion died on the floor of that closet. I sat there for a long time, with the folder open in my lap, my back pressed against winter coats that still smelled like other people's lives. Each page felt heavier than the last. Not because of what was written, but because of how carefully it had been recorded. Dates, times. Descriptions written in a neat, controlled hand. Moments taken from ordinary days and reframed into something suspicious. She isolated herself after dinner. Emotional response appeared disproportionate. Possible fixation en l'os. They didn't sound like family notes. They sounded like documentation. That's when the fear stopped being vague and became sharp. This wasn't about keeping the household safe. This was about creating a narrative one where they were responsible, rational adults, and I was an unstable presence that needed to be removed for everyone's well-being. The idea settled into my chest slowly, painfully, like cold water seeping through clothes. They were preparing to let me go. I put the folder back exactly how I'd found it. I lined up the edges. I closed the closet door quietly. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I went back to my room and sat on my bed, staring at the wall, trying to understand what someone does when the people responsible for protecting them are quietly planning their exit. From that day on, I started watching them the way they'd been watching me. I noticed how Carol's phone calls stretched longer when I walked into the room, her voice lowering, her body turning away. I noticed how Mark began leaving work early on certain days, coming home with that same controlled calm that always preceded important conversations. I noticed new words entering their vocabulary: options, support systems, professionals spoken carefully, like stepping stones across a river they didn't want to fall into. They never said my name when they used those words. They didn't need to. I felt it in the way they looked at me now, not with fear exactly, but with distance. Like you look at something you've already decided you can't keep, something you're mentally preparing to hand off to someone else. Dinner conversations became rehearsed. Neutral topics only. Weather, school schedules, nothing that might lead to emotion, nothing unpredictable. I learned that my silence made them comfortable, so I gave them plenty of it. I learned that agreeing quickly kept their shoulders relaxed, so I did that too. Inside, though, I was unraveling. Every night, I lay awake listening to the house settle, wondering how long it would be before they told me. Before they sat me down and explained, calmly and kindly, that this arrangement wasn't working, that they had to do what was best for everyone, that it wasn't my fault, but also somehow entirely was. The worst part was the waiting. Being treated like a threat is terrifying. Being treated like a temporary one is unbearable. I started imagining all the places I might end up. Another relative who didn't really want me. A program. A stranger's house where I'd have to start over again, pretending I wasn't already exhausted from pretending. Each possibility felt like a door closing somewhere inside me. One afternoon, I came home and found Carol sitting at the dining table with a stack of pamphlets spread out in front of her. She looked up too quickly, then gathered them into a neat pile, smiling like she'd been caught planning a surprise party. My stomach dropped. She told me they were just resources. She said they wanted to make sure I had support. She said they loved me. Love shouldn't feel like being quietly packed away. That night, Mark knocked on my door and asked if we could talk sometime soon. His voice was gentle, careful, final. I nodded, because nodding had become second nature, even though my hands were shaking under the blanket. After he left, I stared at the door for a long time. I realized then that no matter what I said in that conversation, the story about me was already written. I was no longer a grieving kid who needed patience. I was a risk that needed managing. A responsibility they wanted off their shoulders without looking like villains. They called me family when it made them look good. But when fear entered the room, family was the first thing they were willing to sacrifice. I don't know how long I sat there, replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong, where my pain had crossed some invisible line and turned me into something threatening. All I knew was this. The conversation Mark wanted to have wasn't about helping me stay. It was about deciding where I would go. And as I lay back against my pillow, staring into the dark, a single thought kept repeating in my mind, one that made my chest tighten with dread. If they were already planning my exit, what else were they willing to say about me to make it happen? The conversation came 2 days later. Mark asked me to sit at the table again, the same spot where everything had started to unravel. Carol sat beside him, hands folded, expression practiced into something that looked gentle if you didn't know how to read the tension behind it. Ethan stayed in his room this time. I think even he understood this wasn't something he wanted to witness. They spoke slowly, carefully, like every word had been rehearsed in advance. They said they were worried about me. They said my grief seemed stuck. They said they'd noticed patterns that concerned them. They said they'd talked to professionals. They said they wanted to make sure everyone felt safe and supported. Safe. There it was again. That word that had come to define my place in their house. I waited for them to ask how I felt. I waited for someone to acknowledge that losing my mother might explain some of what they were seeing. I waited for compassion to show up in more than just tone. It never did. Instead, Mark explained that they were considering other arrangements. Somewhere with more structure, more supervision, somewhere better equipped to handle what I was going through. He assured me it wasn't a punishment. Carol added that this didn't mean they didn't care. She said sometimes love means knowing your limits. I stared at the grain of the wooden table and tried to keep my breathing steady. Because in that moment, something finally became clear. This had never been about helping me heal. It was about helping them feel comfortable. My sadness made them anxious. My quiet made them suspicious. My grief reminded them that bad things happen, that life can crack open without warning, and they didn't know how to sit with that, so instead of learning how, they decided to remove the reminder. They were afraid of what they couldn't control. And I was the easiest thing to control by getting rid of. I asked one question, my voice barely above a whisper. I asked what exactly I'd done that made them think I was dangerous. The room went quiet. Carol looked at Mark. Mark cleared his throat. They talked around the question without answering it. They mentioned moods, isolation, online posts, energy, vibes, nothing concrete, nothing real. Just impressions and interpretations that had grown larger the longer they fed them. That's when it hit me how powerless I was in this story. They didn't need facts. They didn't need proof. They had feelings, and those feelings had already turned into decisions. Anything I said now would be filtered through the version of me they'd created in their heads. The threat wasn't something I'd done. The threat was who they believed I was. I didn't cry in front of them. I didn't beg. I nodded and listened and thanked them for being honest, because somewhere along the way I'd learned that showing emotion only made things worse. When the conversation ended, Carol reached out like she might hug me, then hesitated, as if unsure how I'd react. That hesitation told me everything. After that day, the house shifted into a strange in-between state. Nothing was decided yet, but everything was already changing. They spoke to me kindly, but distantly, like people do when they know goodbye is coming. Carol cooked my favorite meals more often. Mark asked fewer questions. It was as if they wanted to leave with clean hands, convinced they'd done their best. At night, I replayed the conversation over and over, trying to understand how grief had turned into a liability, how needing support had made me expendable. I wondered how many other people had been quietly labeled too much, too heavy, too unsettling, simply because their pain didn't fit neatly into someone else's life. I started packing small things without realizing it. A notebook. A necklace my mom had given me. Photos folded carefully into the back of a drawer. I didn't know where I was going, but my body seemed to understand before my mind did. The hardest part wasn't the idea of leaving. It was the realization that staying had never really been an option. They called me family because it sounded right, because it made them look generous, because it fit the story they wanted to tell others about themselves. But when fear entered the picture, when my grief stopped being quiet and convenient, family became conditional. I wasn't being pushed out because I was broken. I was being pushed out because I reminded them that brokenness exists. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling I might not see much longer, another thought crept in, one that scared me more than leaving. If they were willing to rewrite my pain into something dangerous, what would they say about me to the next place they sent me? The night they told me a decision was coming soon, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in the dark listening to the house breathe around me, every familiar sound suddenly feeling temporary. The ticking clock in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, footsteps upstairs when someone turned over in bed. These weren't just sounds anymore. They were reminders that this place had never really been mine, no matter how badly I'd needed it to be. By morning, something inside me felt hollowed out. They started treating me differently after that, softer but colder. Like people do when they've already made up their minds and are just waiting for the right moment to act. Carol asked if I wanted seconds at dinner, but didn't ask how my day was. Mark reminded me to lock the door when I showered, then apologized and said he didn't know why he said that. I knew why. Because in their minds, I wasn't just sad anymore. I was unsafe. That label followed me everywhere, even when nobody said it out loud. I could feel it in the way they watched my expressions, like they were tracking mood swings on an invisible chart. In the way silence made them nervous and emotion made them more so. I learned that the safest version of me was the flattest one. So I disappeared while still being there. I smiled when spoken to. I answered questions quickly. I didn't linger in shared spaces. I stopped listening to music out loud. I stopped crying altogether. Not because the pain was gone, but because I was terrified of confirming the story they'd built about me. Do you know what it feels like to be treated like a threat when all you want is to be held? It feels like your pain turns poisonous the moment someone else notices it. Like grief becomes evidence. Like needing comfort becomes a reason to remove you. The worst moment came when I overheard a phone call I was never meant to hear. I was standing at the top of the stairs when Carol's voice floated up from the living room. She was speaking quietly, carefully, the way people do when they want to sound reasonable. She said my name, then paused, listening. She talked about my background, about the loss, about concerns, about unpredictability, about safety, safety for everyone else. She said she loved me. Then she said she didn't feel equipped to handle me anymore. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, pressing my hand over my mouth so I wouldn't make a sound. My chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself, not because she was scared, but because she'd turned my pain into something frightening. In that moment, I understood how easy it is for people to stop seeing your humanity once fear takes over. How quickly compassion evaporates when it becomes inconvenient. How being called family means nothing when you no longer make people comfortable. They weren't afraid I'd hurt someone. They were afraid I'd disrupt their peace. And that hurt more than anything else they'd done. Days passed in a blur. Meetings were scheduled. Papers were signed. Conversations happened behind closed doors. No one asked me what I wanted. No one asked me where I felt safe. I was talked about, not talked to. Reduced to a problem that needed relocation. I started questioning my own memories. Maybe I really was too much. Maybe my sadness had poisoned the house. Maybe I deserved this for not healing fast enough, quietly enough, neatly enough. That's what being treated like a threat does. It convinces you that your existence is the danger. One afternoon, Mark sat beside me on the couch and told me they'd found a place. He said it was temporary. He said it was supportive. He said this didn't mean they were giving up on me, but his eyes didn't meet mine. I nodded, because nodding had become survival. Inside, something shattered completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt final, like the last piece of hope slipping out of my hands. That night, I packed my bag properly for the first time. Each item felt like an admission of defeat. Clothes folded carefully. My mother's necklace wrapped in tissue. The notebook I'd never shown anyone. I held it for a long time before putting it in the bag, realizing it was the only place my truth still existed without being questioned. I wasn't leaving because I was dangerous. I was leaving because they decided my pain was easier to send away than to sit with. As I zipped the bag closed, my hands shaking, one thought kept repeating over and over, louder than anything else in my mind. They called me family. But when fear showed up, they chose to protect themselves from me. And as I turned off the light in my room, knowing it might be the last time, a terrifying question settled deep in my chest. If the people who claimed to love me could turn my grief into a threat so easily, what chance did I have with anyone else? The morning I left, the house felt unnaturally calm. No raised voices, no tears, no dramatic goodbyes. Carol made breakfast like it was any other day. Mark checked his watch twice. The air was thick with politeness. the kind that exists when everyone is trying to convince themselves they're doing the right thing. I carried my bag down the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Not because of what I was taking with me, but because of what I was leaving behind. Not a home, not safety, just the hope that maybe, somewhere inside those walls, I had mattered. Carol hugged me at the door. This time, she held on a second longer than before, like she was trying to prove something to herself. She whispered that she hoped I understood. Mark nodded and said this was for the best. Ethan didn't come out of his room. No one said they were sorry. As the car pulled away, I watched the house shrink in the distance. I waited for the relief they promised would come once I was supported. I waited for the sense of clarity, the understanding that this was necessary. What I felt instead was grief layered on top of grief. Not just for my mother, but for the version of myself that still believed family meant protection. The place they sent me to wasn't cruel. That almost made it worse. It was quiet, structured, neutral. No one yelled. No one accused. But the label followed me there, invisible and heavy. The way people asked questions. The way notes were taken while I spoke. The way concern always hovered just a little too close to suspicion. I was careful with my words. I learned how to sound stable. I learned how to package my pain into neat, acceptable sentences. I learned how to perform healing so no one would get uncomfortable. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The more space I had away from them, the clearer my mind became. I started to see the truth that had been impossible to see while I was trapped inside their fear. My grief hadn't made me dangerous. My sadness hadn't made me unstable. What scared them wasn't me, it was what I represented. I was proof that life can fall apart. I was proof that love doesn't protect you from loss. I was proof that pain doesn't follow a schedule. They didn't know how to live with that, so they called it a problem. They called it a risk. They called me a threat. One night, weeks later, I opened my notebook again. The one place where my thoughts had never been edited or evaluated. I read pages I barely remembered writing. Pages full of pain, yes, but also strength, awareness, humanity. Nothing about them was dangerous. That's when I felt it for the first time, not relief, not happiness, but something quieter and more powerful, clarity. They didn't send me away because I was broken. They sent me away because I wouldn't break the way they wanted. I stopped blaming myself after that. Not all at once. Healing doesn't work like that. But little by little, the shame loosened its grip. I stopped wondering what was wrong with me, and started asking what kind of people mistake grief for a threat. The answer wasn't comforting, but it was freeing. Years have passed since then. I don't speak to them anymore. Not out of anger, but out of self-respect. Some people don't deserve access to your life, no matter what title they hold. Sometimes, though, I still think about that house. About how easily love turned into fear. About how quickly family became conditional. And I wonder how many others are out there right now, sitting quietly in rooms that don't feel safe, being watched instead of understood. If that's you, if you've ever been treated like a problem for having pain, I need you to hear this. You were never the threat. You were the mirror. And they couldn't stand what they saw. I walked away labeled dangerous. But I carried something with me they never managed to touch.